I would like to welcome Mario Bianco to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Mario is a hydrologist. Well, actually, he's got many different degrees, as you will learn during the podcast. And he's currently working in international consultancies in environmental hydraulics with the World Bank and the UN and the Red Cross and many different agencies. So he has worked in about 12 different countries over his short career, which is just amazing, on WASH issues, water, sanitation, and hygiene in crisis situations. And today we're going to focus on his recent work in Ukraine and then Syria, work in Syria and Somalia, although he's worked in many other countries. Thank you so much, Mario, for joining me.
Thanks to you.
Maybe you want to describe a little bit about what WASH is and how that functions with international aid.
Yeah, so the acronym WASH stands for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene. And it makes a specific sector in international aid where projects concern water supplies, sewage, the distribution of hygiene items, and a variety of themes that somehow connect to this. I've been working in WASH for the United Nations and several organizations, and for quite a few years I've been working for the International Red Cross, and there the engineering department, has a slightly different name. It's called Water and Habitat, because it deals with engineering, so as a whole, so also with construction and electric supplies, etc. And well, this gave me the amazing opportunity really to work on practical issues in several countries and always in fragile settings. So beside the engineering and the technical part, there's always a social part, which is relevant and which might be a real challenge to deal with.
Right. So one of your most recent positions was working as a project manager in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think in 2023, 2024. And of course, everybody realizes that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 and a lot of other things going on since then. So maybe you can first provide a little background to the listeners on our Ukraine. I mean, for many people, we hear about it all the time in the news. It's about a 600,000 square kilometer area, about the size of Texas. And the population peaked in 1993 with about 52 million people, and then declined gradually to 46 million in 2014, and then a big decline to 38 million in 2023. So a lot of refugees after the war in 2022, and internally displaced persons, IDPs. So maybe you can describe that a little bit, Mario.
Yeah, definitely. So Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. And to my knowledge, had already, before the beginning of the war, the lowest birth rate in Europe. So population growth has been a challenge since several years there. The war in Ukraine started in 2014. In 2022, a full-scale invasion happened. Russia invaded the whole country, but the war happened in 2014, and this is a date which all the Ukrainians remember well, as the life of everyone in the country changed back then. The war started with the invasion of Crimea and the eastern part of Donbass in Ukraine. The war continued for several years, somehow they say at a low intensity, and then in 2022 the intensity of violence spread countrywide. So I used to work in Ukraine for a UN agency managing different offices of engineers, and a program which used to be called Water in Emergency. So we were working on water supplies together with water utilities in urban and rural settings in southern and eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv, Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipro. Yeah, I happen to move a lot, to visit projects, to speak with engineers. And because of the nature of the humanitarian work and how the funding system work for the UN and for NGO, a big part of the project was really to develop proposal and to advocate for funds. So my job was mainly to deal with the local water utilities called vodokanals in Ukraine, and to understand from them what were the issues in several parts of the countries. Of the country, and then to coordinate with other organizations and UN agencies who operated in the same areas in order to make up projects together and to avoid overlapping. All organizations in humanitarian aid are grouped in clusters. So we were part of the WASH cluster, an ensemble of organizations that deal with the same topic in similar areas. And so UNICEF in Ukraine is the UN agency that coordinates the different organizations that are part of the cluster. So, and to detect projects and to prioritize projects out of outstanding needs country-wise, to consider requests that might come directly from the water utilities, from the government, from local communities, etc., makes a big part of the work. As well as producing proposal to be shared with international donors, would normally come back with questions that needs a reply, and everything is done in quite a tight time frame. And so it is always a teamwork, really. So there was me, but it was a large team of bright Ukrainians engineers, and of course a large international staff, and things are always done together. So this is perhaps one of the parts which I preferred more of. The job. So back then, it
Sounds
is
like
and
it's a
will
very
be a real
challenging. Yeah.
teamwork.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
sounds very challenging. I mean, so I appreciate you mentioning the low birth rate in Ukraine, because when I look at the population time series, I see from early 90s through 2020, just a gradual decline from 55 million to about 45 million. And then I saw a UN report recently, which indicated from 2014 to the present, there was 10 million people left refugees from Ukraine. And these are in many different countries in Europe. I guess, they said about 1 million each in Russia, Germany, neighboring countries, Poland, and then about 0.2 million in many other countries or less in many other countries in Europe. So that's a good, nice context. And you arrived in Ukraine in September, right? September 23. Yeah. And so that was after the dam was the Kakova Dam was destroyed, right? In June 23.
Yeah. So it was after, and the program for the UN agency I used to work for was already established somehow. So I didn't have to contribute starting anything from scratch, but rather I had to fit into something which was already existing. And you mentioned Kakhovka Dam destruction. This is probably one of the major dramas that happen in Ukraine, being Kakhovka, so a large dam that used to produce electricity as well for the country. And after its destruction, a large area was flooded. A large number of pumping stations were not provided anymore through electric supply. and a number of settlements in the area lost water provision. And so we had to work or to start working in the very same areas in order to provide people there with a backup. And here, so before I was thinking about what to say on this podcast, I had a few lines in mind. Something that always impressed me in Ukraine and everywhere really is people resilience. So even before international agencies come with large funds and knowledge, I mean, it's not unusual, really, people to already have settled, so set up so by themselves something in order to keep living. And yeah, so what happened in the area of Fakhovka Dam, for instance, is that as a backup supply, the government and international agencies identified groundwater. But to my knowledge, and then that was already my understanding while I was in Ukraine, there were not many data about groundwater there really, and it was really hard to implement geophysics, being the area close to the front line. We couldn't fly drones, of course, or helicopters, but even we couldn't go there on the field, so we didn't have easy access there. So. Probably is the connection among different agencies, the government and water utilities that consented and consents so right now to find out information and to get a general understanding about the context. Before, as we mentioned, the demographic issue in Ukraine, it came to my mind that might not be obvious to think about this. So I think it wouldn't be so for me, but this directly affect the management and water supplies. Beside the demographic issue, so many men so has to join the army, and although of course so the government try to protect specific roles which are functional or needed for infrastructure to keep functioning, it's so. It's remarkable. So the impact that the loss of human resources, the loss of knowledge and skills has on the management of complex infrastructures in Ukraine, as well as in Syria, or in any place I happened to work and where infrastructures were actually developed. So this happened in Ukraine as well. It was hard for us to find hydrogeologists in Ukraine. It was hard for us to find drillers. And of course, the drillers willing to move in an area where anything can happen. Yeah, exactly. So those are
challenging from all sides. Yeah, right. I hadn't really even thought about the loss of manpower and stuff, because they're they're fighting, and so you probably have lost a lot of engineers and all of those people. I hadn't thought about that, but when I was looking up, Peter Glick has a database on water conflict chronology, and it was really nice, very detailed description of all of the impacts on water from conflict in Ukraine. And I think as early as 1941, the first dam that was built in the mid-30s and then bombed in 41 by the Russians. So it's been these sorts of things have been going on for a long time. And the Kakhovka Dam you mentioned, that's held, the reservoir stored about almost 20 cubic kilometers of water before it was destroyed. And that's most people in the US, they use the term million acre feet, but 1 million acre feet is about 1.2 cubic kilometers. So the units are similar. So when the dam burst, then you lost a lot of water, and that flooded all of the surrounding regions. But then groundwater levels also dropped a lot because you lowered the base level. So maybe you could describe. So you had to drill deeper to get the groundwater.
Well, so while I was in Ukraine, we started the study. So we didn't drill, but the purpose was to actually drill. Then my assignment ended. So But to our understanding, based on feedback that we received from the water utilities so in the area, from governmental actor, the water level into existing boreholes dropped, and many boreholes actually had no water anymore. And this, I suppose, made even more difficult to estimate the cost of drilling, because one at that point would be supposed to drill deeper. And there were plenty of consequences of the destruction of the dam. For instance, there were vast areas downstream from the dam covered through by minefields, to my knowledge. And water would, I suppose, displace the mines, make the mining more complicated, and so these areas became even less accessible than what already so they used to be before. And because we mentioned about borehole drilling, now, so perhaps something which a researcher or someone working in the private sector here in Europe, so for instance, might not think is that in no profit, despite the fragile context and the challenging situation, there are some strict financial constraints that also apply to large UN agencies and NGO. So, for instance, we would drill a borehole doing a study, and then we would call a contractor to drill, and perhaps the same contractor who did the study, so that if the study is poorly done, we penalize one contractor, and that's less headache for everyone. But in a profit, it might be hard so to do this, or it might require a variety of justifications, because in terms of finance, and this is already a big part of the job, everything should be well justified, and everything should be done according to a proper procedure. And everything which doesn't correspond to that procedure has to be justified and explained to non-technical people that might not understand our vocabulary, our issues, etc. So, for instance, it might not be allowed the contractor who did the study to also drill. This is something which in no profit, often doesn't happen. And if it happens, then it should be explained to the donor, to the government which provided the money, etc. Why this happened? Why with these exceptions? Or for instance, there's a very limited range of variability in the cost of contracts. So control cost is a big thing, really. So if we budgeted money for drilling down to 100 meter, and the borehole finally requires a 200 meter depth, well, this is not an obvious change, really. So once we do a contract, we should be more or less sure about so the depth, or it might be extremely time consuming to edit contracts, to edit costs, etc. And actually to deal with financial constraints, which are a part of the job as we work with someone else's money, often happens to be more challenging than the context in itself. In Ukraine, for instance, in many areas we were supposed to work for drilling aquifers or groundwater might happen to be in fracture aquifers at depth, particularly because the superficial aquifers might not be able to provide water of a proper quality for drinking. So not being able to run much geophysics, not having much information about the place there. I believe that a good approach might be to drill exploratory boreholes. So to drill some of them and see what's going on under the surface. But that also might be challenging in terms of finance. How may we explain to a donor that we drill a borehole without equipping the borehole and without extracting the water? There's a variety of themes which are probably obvious to anyone who deal with water or did this job for some time. I mean, so I don't think there's
Right.
anything
But
so
I
complicated. Not.
guess, Mario, you would think you have enough challenges with the providing water in these emergency situations that you wouldn't have to deal with the bureaucracy of, worrying
Definitely,
about a budget or worrying about a
definitely,
contract
definitely.
and everything. So I think it's nice that you highlight that in addition to all of the other constraints in these crisis areas,
Yeah,
that you also have to deal with these mundane things that we think about
yeah,
in trying to. So, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine. You had, almost 20 cubic kilometers of water in the reservoir. How you could try to replace, the water use with groundwater? I mean, drilling wells. How many wells did you end up drilling, or were
yeah.
you successful in drilling, or?
Me, I didn't drill. So
Well,
when I was
right,
there, so we started the study. There was a plan from the government, which I believe in it is still there. I didn't receive updates. Anyway, to drill a few tens of borers, I don't remember how many, to provide water for different settlements. So basically, so drinking water. And for what I recall, although I may not be sure about it, but the focus was on drinking water. So irrigation, etc., might have been dealt with as a separate issue. And something which is also interesting, so in my opinion, about that is that so Ukraine has a solid legislation, environmental legislation in terms of groundwater exploitation and drilling. It is hard really to drill in Ukraine. Perhaps it is hard to drill in Britain as well. I mean, so I guess so. There's always a variety of steps, but even authorities, I believe, might not think about the complexity of these things until the problem really arises. So for us, it took quite some time to understand the legislation and to understand how maybe we navigated the legislation, because the government, of course, tried to help to release some waivers. You say, yeah, for so I live in Oxford, but I am not from Oxford, as you can get my accent. Anyway, yeah. So to facilitate a bit the work for several agencies, but so it was not clear for us if these waivers would apply to us as well or only to governmental actors and these kind of things. So despite of the context and perhaps the most obvious challenges that might relate to war and so fragile social situations. There's a number of issues which come
right,
so on top of it. Plus, we deal so with engineers in our team that all of them connect with drama, so within their own families. It might not be so straightforward, even for us to ask to an engineers to move from one oblast, one region of Ukraine to another. There's plenty of checkpoints. They must have documents. They might be stopped. They might be inquired why they didn't join the army. It's very hard. In Ukraine, it was even harder for me. The context is in Syria. I mean, so not for me because I was international staff, but also for our staff who was so from the place. And so every day, the human part and the challenges which each engineer experience in his personal life, of course, not only mine, obvious, so have an
yeah.
impact on work. And in my opinion, this is a key features of so a key feature of managers so in the sector to be aware about the perspective the large part of our staff actually live the experience and have to go to work so every morning.
Right, right. So that's very interesting. You don't think about these things, the environmental regulations,
Yeah,
the costs and the budget constraints and all of these different things on top of the actual real situation where you're just trying to get some
yeah,
work done, and then engineers trying to come from other regions and and documents. And I guess oblast is a kind of a state, is like a state. And so going from one state to the next, if they have to travel and documents and all of that sort of thing, that's just incredible. So, you work in the wash sector, water, sanitation, and hygiene. And so sanitation is also a big part of that. And so with the loss of the hydroelectricity, and Kakova Dam was providing about 350 megawatts of hydroelectricity. So with the loss of that electricity, then did you lose water treatment, and was it difficult to treat water? So, or even sewage treatment and all of that sort of thing? Was that a big issue for you there?
Well, definitely the delivery of services so had to be pre-managed, so from the government. And so available resources were so redistributed among so essential services. I suppose that we mainly experienced the long hours of power cuts where people so in their own homes. The government tried to keep running the essential services. And it must be said that so as part of the warfare, of the Russian warfare, so water treatment station, water pumping station, electric supplies are by purpose hit in order to make life difficult for persons there. A part of all the secondary effects of shillings that might break pipelines, etc. But still, so we work on sewage so as well. The projects that I have been involved in concerning sewage were about replacing sand for sewage treatment facilities, as far as I remember, or replacing pumps. The focus was mainly on water, but sewage as well. Yeah. And in terms of hygiene, we had a unit. We had a unit that used to distribute soap and hygiene articles, particularly in places close to the front line, in the immediate afterwards of an attack. So, for instance, people might have to leave the houses. They might be welcome in places that are already organized to welcome displaced persons. And some of the articles that are essential at the beginning and that might not be available are really the hygiene articles, and those were part of the job really to ship them, and there were post services in Ukraine as well that provided this work for humanitarian. So they facilitate by making available their own means the transport of packages from our stock to the front line. So yeah, we in terms of wash we experience the whole the whole range of services really. But mainly water.
Right, yeah. And so you mentioned a couple of important points. I mean, in addition to the 6 or the 7 million refugees that went to other countries in Europe, mostly the surrounding countries, you have a lot of internally displaced people. So before, in 2021, when I was looking at the data, there were less than 1 million, about 0.8 million internally displaced people, so IDPs. And then that increased to almost 6 million in 22, but then dropped again to 3.7 million in 23 and 24. So then you have to manage all of those people. Are they generally clustered in sort of camp situations, or how are these organized, these IDPs?
Yeah, well, the government organized a specific structure to welcome displaced persons. So Russia, the Russian army, reached the outskirts of Kiev in 2022. The situation was quite unpredictable, and a large part of population from eastern Ukraine moved to the western part, and then moved back to their houses whenever the war actually concentrated in a specific part of the country, and this explained the rapid population movement. Now, so I was not so involved myself into so following up on this, but the agency I was working for provided services for structures that would welcome persons. And I should say that the Ukrainian government was quite well organized, so my opinion, is in
Right.
this.
Yeah,
And
yeah. And Kiev is the capital, right? About a
yeah, Kyiv is
population
the
of 3
capital. It's the
million.
capital of
Yeah.
Ukraine. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. A
Um,
beautiful city.
and you sent me a little while ago, you sent me a dashboard that had multi-sector WASH data on it for
Yeah,
Ukraine, multi-sector needs assessment, which I thought was very interesting in describing, water availability and the sources of water. And, I guess when I was looking at it, and it represented the period from June to August 2023, and indicated that the water source is about 40% piped water, almost 50% boreholes and wells. And I guess this is for potable water total in Ukraine, and 13% bottled water. So
yeah,
it's a really nice dashboard to describe, treatment options, whether there was a scarcity
yeah.
issues, and those sorts of things.
Yeah. So, big cities, urban settlements, so are normally well served through water networks. But the situation is quite different in rural Ukraine, for what I've seen. Quite basic wells or water infrastructures might be the only existing thing there. And even before the beginning of the war, anyway, in the status of water supplies in urban settlements in Ukraine, I suppose was already fragile because of large water leakages. To prepare for my assignment, I read a few documents. I didn't find very many available online. But I recall I read a report from the World Bank that was prepared sometime in the 90s, I think. And it's already mentioned leakages in some urban settlements above 30, if not 50%. And because of water treatment required today as well for water to flow into urban networks, this issue, the poor efficiency of water networks implies massive additional cost for the water utilities that have to spend money in big quantities of aluminum sulfate or chlorine, whatever is needed for water treatment, and these quantities are wasted. And I suppose we are talking about tons of chemicals. There's a term which is used in these circumstances. It's about non-revenue water, so water which is not
Nobody
paid back.
paying for it.
So
Yeah.
exactly. So by the
Mhm.
users, and this goes so on top of several challenges for the water utilities that also have to pay their own team. They have to procure the chemicals. However, in this fragile settings, now we're talking about Ukraine, it could be anywhere really. Whenever the government or whatever actor is in power for any reason doesn't provide enough to utilities to keep running the infrastructures, where ideally this is where the international community step in and make available funds to international agencies for keep running the system in cooperation with the government, of course. So everything is done with a constant dialogue with the actor. So we're supposed to manage the service. And yeah, so that's really
Yeah.
so the fundamental part of our work, really.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I guess a lot of the issues that you mentioned are issues we have in developed and all countries, really. So pipe leaks and all that sort of thing. And that represents a big loss of energy, because the energy used to treat that water, then you're losing it without using it. So in addition to the water loss, then there's the energy loss. And then you mentioned all of the chemicals that you need to use to treat it. And then that goes down the drain, But you also bring up an important point between urban settings that have networks and everything, and then rural settings. So we have the same issue in the US, the difference between small community water systems in rural areas not having the funds to, deal with contamination or other, drought or other issues versus urban areas that have funds to maintain systems. So, and it sounds like from the World Bank report that they were already fragile even before the war. So it wasn't starting off from a good point.
Yeah, exactly. And in Ukraine, there is one more thing that I was about to forget. The heating system as well works through water. Like water is the mean used for heat transfer, which is the same in my country, in Southern Europe also, I guess. So, however, which means that a part of the work of the agency I used to work for was about rehabilitating and keep running heating system, which are systematically targeted. This implied providing means for water treatment, because the water for being used as a mean for heat transfer so has to be of a certain chemistry, installing pipes, pumps, etc. And this was for me the first time to actually witness work on this heating system done to that scale in Ukraine, really. So yeah.
So I guess I know this is not part of WASH, but I mean, another aspect is food, food supplies and food security and all of that. So Ukraine is a big, is a wheat basket of Europe, I guess, and supplies wheat and maize and oil seeds to many different countries. So I was looking at the international trade data, and, it was up to 55 billion in 2021, and then dropped to 38 billion in 22 after the war. But food is a big part of that. And so 26 billion for food exports in 22. So, and then oil seeds, a big part of that, and cereals and stuff. So it may not have impacted Ukraine so much because they produce so much food, but it probably impacted the exports and the countries that were dependent on Ukraine more.
Definitely. Yeah. So there's good news. So on this side, I guess it was last week or so, a couple of weeks ago. So recently, so anyway, so Ukraine managed to ship large quantity of grain to Syria. So despite the war, they still managed to run the production, and so this is an effect of the war, which I think should be considered really. So the global effect of Ukraine, so not being able to produce as much as it used in the past, not being able to export, particularly because the navigation of ships in the Black Sea, it's way harder now than what it used to be in the past, etc. And this war doesn't only concern Ukraine really. So it has an impact, so particularly on countries which might have a limited capacity to produce enough food for their own, and they had big quantities received from Ukraine. This was studies, was published, etc. So anyone might want to have access to this kind of information. So I haven't worked on irrigation really, but
well, I mean, I think Lorenzo Rosa had a paper indicating that less than 2% of agricultural production was irrigated. So I don't think irrigation wasn't a big part of the production, which is good, but there's potential to expand it in the future.
Oh, definitely, yeah. So there's a lot of water in Ukraine. On that, there's no doubt.
So, just to finish talking about Ukraine, how do you see rehabilitation happening there? I mean, it's just such a long road. It's so challenging.
The situation is so very fragile, and unpredictable. So we don't know. So what could happen? So in the future, however, cities, particularly the closest to the front line, for instance, Kharkiv, were thinking of how to build resilience. So perhaps how to rehabilitate the former boreholes, etc., in order to have for themselves enough water in case anything happened to the existing water supply, etc. In Ukraine, so there are already projects of development. So something that might not aim at restoring the service as it used to be in the past, or just at providing the minimum quantity of water. There were also projects that aimed at stepping up standards in order to bring them closer to, or just the same to the European one. I suppose this happens mainly so in the western part of the country, in areas far from hostilities. But so it is happening now, and it's so. I think it is something peculiar of the context, and this mix between emergency response, development, upgrades. Well, however, the situation is unpredictable now as it used to be so years ago. But so from my point of view, I really admire the commitment of the water utilities in Ukraine and the
Right.
team we have to work with. I had the chance to participate to a meeting of this local network of water utilities, and for me to sit with them, to talk to them, understand the issues, and try to with them to design projects which are not standalone projects, but they work together in order to organically build up a program so to converge into a unique scope. That for me was the best part of the assignment, really, in Ukraine and and everywhere. And just for sharing something more personal, I think that working on infrastructures in general, but particularly working on water, well, in my opinion, give a chance someone to really step into the life of persons and understand. Well, so depends. I might not understand everything, or if I understand a bit, I'm already happy. But at least to observe some dynamics which are anything but obvious, really. And we spoke about infrastructures. That contribution to the international aid system is normally called assistance, so technical assistance, the delivery of technical service. But in my opinion, this is not the core and should not be the core of international aid. So as engineers, or technicians, so whatever we are, we work on a specific component of the program, but we always work with non-technical persons that have a more political role, which is essential in international aid, really. Who are the ones who relate with the authorities, should understand the context in its own complexity and really drive operations. It might be something else, perhaps, that was saying that is obvious to anyone who worked in humanitarian aid, I think, but maybe not so obvious outside, is that infrastructures have additional meanings in a fragile context. It is not just the water network or the well or whatever, is whatever come with it. Sometimes, an agency might be able to deliver a variety of services to a certain area where the access was denied at first, just because at first that agency managed to convince the community of let them rehabilitate in a well. And trust is built step by step. Of course, this was not the case in Ukraine. In Ukraine, in areas controlled by the government, we had access. But in other contexts, it's way more challenging. For instance, Afghanistan, while the American soldiers were still there, the access in certain areas was really hard, and trust had to be built over the years with the different stakeholders in order to be able
Right.
to deliver medical service, etc. And maybe everything started from water. So yeah,
So
this
yeah,
is
I guess it's really nice that you describe it's not just technical. It's
no, yeah,
social, it's cultural, and it all fits together. And it's nice how you describe that. Maybe they will be more resilient in the future after this.
yeah,
Situation. I mean, this is a dreadful situation, but having backup water supplies, having backup energy, water treatment, and all of those, so that they're more resilient in the future. So maybe we will jump to Syria, where you were
let's
working
do.
in for many years in 2021 and 2017, and it's been in the news recently because of the change in politics. So maybe you can describe that a little bit, the political situation, how that has evolved over time, and then your work there.
Yeah. Well, just to give a general context, in 2011, um, um, various populations in several countries took part to the so-called Arab Spring. So I don't know where this term so came from. So anyway, and a change of governments happened as a consequence of this. Um, in Syria, there was a dictatorship, a very harsh dictatorship. And the dictatorship repressed the opposition at first, and actually the first protest violently. Um, the response of the government was extremely violent, and according to some voices that I heard, even more violent than what many young Syrians back then would expect. Um, the war evolved over time, and other groups step in, and we heard about ISIS, of course, and other groups that were inspired by different thoughts. But at the beginning, the protests were really for a change in regime, and they started in Dara, in southern Syria, and which is an area where I had the chance to work really. So the first time I was in Syria was in 2017, and I worked along the coastline. Um, and that area, well, that's the area where many working in the government of Syria back then used to come from. The family of Assad used to come from one of the cities. And yeah, so violence happened there already as well, but the war was mainly in other parts of the country. That area always stayed under the control of the government. So was a place which received a large number of internally displaced persons from other places, Aleppo, Homs, etc. So the main purpose of our projects there really was about resizing the water infrastructures. Like water infrastructure being designed for a certain number of users happened at some point quite drastically to serve a larger number of persons. And then we had to cover up needs. And also we worked on rehabilitating summer houses close to the beach, so holiday houses that became houses for IDP, as well as medical facilities, etc. Now, something particular of the context there for me was that, so as I said, many working in the government, so back then it used to come from that area. So it was not unusual really to receive phone calls or a strong push for running projects in villages which didn't seem to be in need, or not particularly, but maybe because someone in the government related to them, to these places. And well, I'm saying this because the purpose was about drawing a portrait of the daily life of engineers working in fragile context. Well, this is part of the dynamic really. So to filter out requests and to deal diplomatically with different actors that so on one side might push for projects, but on the other side are the ones who give the possibility to international agencies to work in certain areas. And well, it is clear then wherever the government is harsh and wherever dictatorship is in place, the government might not care about giving any kind of service to their citizens. So the negotiation is harsh, and nothing is obvious really. It's not obvious that entire villages who do not receive any water will receive a permission. So we receive services from an international agency. It is not obvious that the access is given to the international agencies to deliver aid. This really go through plenty of talks and negotiation, and I suppose there's something about trust in there. It's so it's a complex thing, but so it's a key part of the job,
Right.
really.
Right.
Yeah.
So, in contrast to Ukraine, where the population was declining because of the low
Yeah.
birth rate, population in Syria had been increasing a lot since I see
Yeah.
from the 80s on, or maybe even earlier. But it went from like 10 million in 1980 to maybe 23 million in 2011. And then you mentioned Arab Spring, and then it was under Assad's son, Bashir, I guess, who was in power. And so pretty tough dictatorship. And then the Arab Spring in 2011, then full-blown conflict then by 2013, and population decreased a lot of refugees. So I think I was looking up some of the data, about 3 million refugees in Turkey from Syria, and about 0.75 million in Lebanon, and also a similar number in Jordan, and a lot in Germany also. So a lot of refugees leaving Syria to go into other countries. And then in addition to that, I guess you've got a lot of, almost 6 million internally displaced people, yeah. So it's a difficult situation. But also, I guess I was looking at energy generation. So a large reduction in electricity production from 2011 on, and that would affect water treatment and all of those things also, and providing water, I guess.
Definitely. Yeah. So water treatment, so an interesting aspect of the war in Syria was that so chlorination was hard to implement during the war because chlorine could be used to produce chemical weapons. So humanitarian actors had a waiver for importing chlorine into Syria. And that was really a key task for us, to import chlorine and to grant the continuous water treatment, even for large cities. I've been involved in a project in Latakia. And of course, I say I, so because I'm talking, but so I really like to underline, it's always a teamwork.
The royal we.
And the job is done by the Syrian engineers. The international staff has a role really, but it's a teamwork really. And
right. And I guess it emphasizes how all of these things are connected. So in electricity generation, water treatment, water availability, water quality, sewage treatment, all of these things are connected and impacted then by war and so
power cuts and so whatever. There used to be villages on the coastline in 2017. They would receive water a few hours every few weeks, and we have been working there, replacing horizontal pumps for repumping water. So up the mountain, etc. So this, of course, reflected on the daily life of persons. And when I come back in Syria in 2021, so back then the war had settled, so more or less in large part of the country, the government had retaken control. Well, I had the feeling that the economy was much worse than in 2017, and the power cut, even in Damascus, used to be much longer. So I can't tell if this is a trend, but so it could be in the afterwards of a war. Whenever the light of the scene like shut down and attention moves elsewhere, where, well, this is a time where international funds also drop. And this is the time when the economy might collapse. And this is what happened in Syria. Um, so, yeah, I mean, so I promised myself to speak about water. So I will. So
Well, I
otherwise,
mean,
we got
yeah,
a second
right.
podcast. But yeah.
I mean, I guess one positive thing, which is, our colleague Saeed Mana, who is
Yeah.
working on, the fact that agriculture greatly decreased as a result of the war in Syria, and then so groundwater depletion was not as much, and so groundwater levels rose, and springs started flowing again, and things like that in the Orontes Basin that he was working on. So that's
Yeah.
interesting, aspect.
So you know something about water, which I think it's interesting because yeah. Anyway, so people started to use in the outskirts of Damascus and in many areas sewage for irrigation. Um, because that was the water available. And well, in the outskirts of Damascus, there's also a large sewage treatment plant whose functionality was interrupted, I think, or massively decreased as an effect of the war. That's the story behind. So anyway, and this created a large groundwater contamination in the outskirts of Damascus. So where people used to drink from boreholes. The same aquifer so was not usable anymore, and so water supplies had to be developed in order to restore the service. Now, just to give the portrait, entire cities or towns around Damascus were empty as a consequence of the war. So I've been working in some of them. Only a few families started to come back, and these few families amazed me in terms of resilience, how they managed to have some electricity, some water, just by themselves, by reconnecting to some boreholes in the areas, or building up some Frankenstein, how you say, so electric networks, etc. Uh, because you mentioned so electricity, a common thing that I noticed is that transformers that normally are coupled with submersible pumps are normally removed, and the circuits inside are being stolen. And so I don't think one could make much money out of it. I don't know, but so I think so are kind of easy to steal. So the replacement of transformer was a large part really of our work in order to restore the water supplies. So in a country as Syria, where the electric supply is also complex in terms of high, medium, and low voltage. The existence of transformer, the existence of station able to transform the power from high to medium, and all these places, so many of these places were destroyed. Well, okay, so what I want to say is that so it is not just water. Water, electricity, they all go together, and they all serve the purpose to restore essential services. In this case, water. So nothing, it's a box in itself, really. And this is, I suppose, the idea behind naming a department Water and Habitat for the International Red Cross, in order to be able to deliver a variety of services that integrate with each other.
And have you heard anything recently about, since the regime changed recently, you think many people would be returning to Syria now?
Well,
many
I read news. I actually, yeah, so I read a UN report. So right before this podcast, but the results were based on surveys, to understand it. So I read quickly. So yeah, it seems that anyway, so a large number of persons are willing to return. And of course, uncertainties exist. But yeah, I think so. I
Right.
think so. It's always good to be so positive. So sometimes it might look naive or so whatever, but so for me, Syria was a bright example of resilience. Really, was a
Right.
was a very intense and constructive human experience. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think so. This is something which I learned in Syria as well as in Ukraine, of course.
Right, right. So I guess just for the listeners, I mean, Ukraine is about the size of Texas and Syria is about the size of California.
I've been in California on holidays. I didn't really think about the dimension of the place, but yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Really.
So I guess the last area I would like to just cover briefly with you, Mario, and our guest today is Mario Bianco, who works for international consultancies and develop in many different crisis situations, WASH sector. So you work in East Africa, you worked in Somalia in 2011, 2012, and also in some refugee camp in Kenya. In nearby Kenya. So maybe you can describe the situation there and what you were doing.
Yeah, I worked in the Dadaab refugee camp in 2012. Yeah, in summer 2012. It was in the afterwards of a dramatic drought which affected the eastern horn of Africa. So other droughts happened afterwards. That one was already a massive one. And back then, Dadaab used to be the largest refugee camp in the world. As far as I remember, there used to be more than 350,000 persons. When I went there, it was already in the afterwards of the big crisis. So it was not much in the news anymore, but people were still there. And we used to work on water supplies. The initial purpose of our presence there, I was working for an NGO, was to work in the refugee camp. But then, despite the massive number of international agencies, the emergency, etc., insecurity was remarkable there. Some colleagues were kidnapped and released afterwards. So anyway, but because of that, we had to change plans, and we mainly work with the host community in the Dadaab town. That that experience was for everyone who used to be so involved there. And first of all, for the Kenyan and Somali staff that used to work for us, and for the refugees, was really intense and challenging in terms of negotiation with the host community there. People living in the Dadaab town who always wanted their own share because of the vast presence of international organizations, because of insecurity, because of the threat that was on any of us in moving out of the compound. We used to move from Nairobi to the Dadaab refugee camp in a convoy, and the first car of the convoy was a car of the Kenyan army. They used to go very slow to assess the road and to detect the presence of unexploded device. So this is well, so it's not a paradox. It's like that in so many places, but it probably sounds as a paradox that actors that are there to deliver aid are actually the international presence, so under threat. And yeah, so there was in Dadaab. We work in schools and the hospital for the rehabilitation of water supplies and latrines. And other agencies, the majority of agencies kept working in the refugee camps, fixing boreholes in an area on the border between Kenya and in Somalia, so in a desert, really. So that was the job, and I've been working in Somalia as well, in Somaliland, which is so an independent country, so de facto, in the north of Somalia, in Hargeisa, but then also in Mogadishu and in other areas of Somalia. And in 2012, they asked me to participate to an assessment in Wajir, an area of Kenya bordering Somalia, in the moment where the drought reached its so how you call it, top point, so most dramatic peak. That's the word. Yeah, and yeah, and that assessment only lasted a couple of weeks, so something like this. But for me, was one of the most intense and chapters of the whole experience. There were persons moving from Somalia into Kenya without anything really. They were collecting resins from tree in order to resell it and get some money. All the animals in the surrounding of this town, Wajir, which is well known in Kenya, were dead. So I remember a few animals, a few cows which survived, being fed through paper and carton. There was skeleton of animals. So on the road, I remember. So giraffes were the few animals that really survived. I suppose because they managed to eat the leaves on the top of trees, and we were staying in a guest house in the center of this town where everything was available because trucks could cross the road and come. But the surrounding of the town already were in dramatic situations, and we ran the assessment and we went there, and well, then the common understanding back then was that it hasn't rained for a few seasons, so there is no water, and that's it. But something that really raised so many thoughts so in my head for several years was that while we were there, we saw the major part of burrows being non-functional. They were broken, there was no fuel, but the few wells were functioning. They were powered through windmills, and they used to, so they were used for irrigation, and there was water. At the same time, the government of Kenya and then eventually, I think, also international agencies started to ship water through water trucking. And there used to be no water tanks, no places able to receive water back then. I recall people collecting water with plastic sheets. So there was no preparedness. And I started to think about the availability of groundwater back then. And I know that more recently studies were done through geophysics, GRACE, etc. I will not step into this because it's not my field, but so I've read them, and I think so they started to give some explanations of what happened. But also I started to think about drought early warning systems. So so this is something so often debated. So I had the debate in a school in Delft, so last summer with a professor, and so anyway, so we had different opinions. So from the perspective of an hydrologist, perhaps early warning would be very hard to implement because weather forecast span a limited time, and so I see the point. But something that I had in mind back then in Wajir was that the price of food was already a massive indicator that something was happening already before the beginnings of the drought. What was the story? The price of meat in the market decreased at first at the beginning of the dry season, before it was such an emergency. I suppose because there was an abundance of meat and then decreased afterwards. But when meat was not available anymore in the market, the crisis was there since already quite some time. So I don't really have an answer, but my thought was always like groundwater were there as a backup system, but boreholes were not functional. And the drought and the emergency was already there before many could actually flag it up.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think, now the Famine Early Warning System Network, Chris Funkin and his group, they provide, up to 6 months warning of upcoming droughts. And then they get aid agencies to cooperate so that they make sure that famine that happened in 2011-12 in the Eastern Horn of Africa is not repeated. And so now the agencies collaborate and work together and provide funding to avoid that sort of calamity. I really appreciate your
great.
painting a portrait for us of what it is like to work in a humanitarian context, and all of the things that we don't think about. Wash in the wash sector. I mean, working with governments, working with regulations, working with contracts and financing. And then the refugee host community interaction and those sorts of things. So a lot of things that, in addition to the major issues that you're dealing with, so a lot piled on top. So I hugely admire you and
So
really
it's not me.
appreciate
So this
all you
thousand
have done.
person that do the same job, really. So
No,
thousand.
I think you are doing amazing work, and I'm glad that you took the time to describe some of these things for the listeners and for me, and I wish you the best in your future
Thank you so
work.
much.
Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck with your future work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.